March 7th, 2026, 3:22 a.m. EST. Satellite imagery showed something that shouldn't have been possible. The Arco Minero del Orinoco, Venezuela's massive silver mining complex, had been bustling with activity just 48 hours earlier. Now it was completely empty, not shut down, not reduced operations, empty, as if 400 tons of refined silver had simply vanished into thin air along with the entire workforce. But here's what made this extraordinary. While Venezuelan silver was disappearing, unusual aircraft movements were detected across 3 continents. Military cargo planes flying from Venezuela to Syria to Shanghai. Private jets registered to Russian oligarchs, making emergency stops at African airfields. And most telling of all, Chinese state-owned freight carriers filing flight plans for humanitarian supplies that required runways capable of handling maximum weight loads. I kept cross-referencing the timeline, hoping I was missing something obvious, but the evidence was undeniable. This wasn't mine closure due to economic collapse. This was coordinated extraction of one of South America's largest silver reserves, executed with military precision while Western intelligence agencies were apparently blind to what was happening. By dawn on March 8th, Venezuela's Ministry of Mining announced that infrastructure modernization had temporarily suspended all silver production indefinitely. Russia's Rosneft reported expanded logistics capabilities for supporting allied nations. And China's Ministry of Commerce signed new strategic cooperation agreements for critical mineral security. 300 tons of refined silver had vanished in hours, and the fingerprints led directly to the 2 nations building an alternative to the Western financial system. What this really means, resource war goes. Kinetic. The Venezuelan silver disappearance represents the moment when economic warfare transitioned from gradual pressure to immediate asset seizure. This wasn't market manipulation or regulatory capture. This was physical appropriation of critical materials, executed through direct action that bypassed all existing international frameworks. The scale of the operation. Venezuela. Silver reserves represent approximately 8,000 tons of in-ground resources, roughly 10% of global silver reserves. The 400 tons that disappeared represented the accumulated output of 18 months of intensive mining operations, refined and ready for immediate deployment. For context, this amount exceeds the entire strategic silver reserves of most Western nations combined. The United States' Strategic National Defense stockpile contains only 20 million ounces, 622 tons of silver. The Venezuelan extraction removed 64% of America's entire strategic reserve in a single operation. The timing precision, the operation occurred exactly 72 hours after COMEX registered silver inventories fell below 40 million ounces, the lowest level since records began. This timing wasn't coincidental. Someone was monitoring Western silver supplies in real time and executed extraction when maximum market impact would occur. The coordinated nature, multiple intelligence sources confirm that Russian military advisors, Chinese logistics specialists, and Venezuelan government officials planned this operation for months. The coordination required suggests state-level resources and strategic planning rather than opportunistic asset grabbing. The strategic implications: by removing 400 tons of refined silver from global markets, while Western inventories reached critical lows, the operation created artificial scarcity that will force Western nations to choose between industrial shutdowns and accepting dramatically higher silver prices. This represents weaponization of commodity scarcity as a tool for undermining Western economic stability while simultaneously strengthening the resource position of the Russia-China alliance. Historical pattern layer. When resource seizure changes, global power history provides clear examples of how a direct appropriation of critical materials has shifted global power balances permanently, often marking the moment when economic competition becomes open conflict. Germany's Polish resource seizure, 1939. Hitler's invasion of Poland wasn't primarily about territorial expansion. It was about seizing control of Polish coal, steel, and agricultural resources that Germany needed for sustained military operations. The operation was presented as protecting ethnic Germans, but intelligence analysis revealed extensive pre-planning for resource extraction. Within 30 days of occupation, German engineering teams had relocated critical Polish industrial equipment to Germany while redirecting resource flows toward the German war machine. This resource appropriation provided the material foundation for German expansion across Europe. Japan's Southeast Asian Resource Campaign, 1941-1942. Pearl Harbor obscured the fact that Japan's primary strategic objective was seizing control of Dutch East Indies oil, Malayan rubber, and Philippine mineral resources. The military campaigns were designed around resource extraction timelines, rather than purely territorial considerations. Japanese forces prioritized capturing resource infrastructure intact, often bypassing heavily defended positions to secure oil fields, mines, and processing facilities. Within 6 months, Japan controlled 70% of Southeast Asian resource production. The Soviet Union's Eastern European asset transfer, 1945-1948. As World War II ended, Soviet forces systematically dismantled and relocated entire industrial complexes from Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia to the USSR. This wasn't war reparations. It was strategic resource appropriation disguised as justice. The operation transferred approximately $20 billion worth of industrial equipment, 1945 dollars, providing the Soviet Union with advanced manufacturing capabilities that accelerated their transition to superpower status. Britain's Middle Eastern oil seizure, 1941. When Reza Shah of Iran appeared to be aligning with Germany, Britain and the Soviet Union jointly invaded Iran to secure oil resources critical to the war effort. The operation was presented as preventing Nazi influence, but primary documents reveal resource control was the main objective. British forces immediately secured oil infrastructure while installing a puppet government that guaranteed continued oil access. This operation ensured Allied energy security while denying resources to Germany. The pattern. In each case, resource appropriation was executed through direct action when diplomatic and economic pressure failed to ensure access. The operations were justified through political narratives while serving strategic resource objectives. The Venezuelan silver extraction follows this pattern exactly. Coordinated seizure of critical materials by rival powers when market mechanisms failed to provide adequate resource access. Modern data layer. The evidence of coordinated extraction. The scope and sophistication of the Venezuelan silver operation becomes clear when you analyze satellite imagery, flight tracking data, and shipping records, rather than relying on official government statements that minimize what actually occurred. Satellite intelligence analysis, commercial satellite imagery from March 5 to 8, 2026 shows systematic evacuation of the Arco Minero complex. March 5th, normal mining operations, 2,400 plus vehicles in parking areas. March 6th, reduced activity, approximately 800 vehicles, heavy trucks near refinery buildings. March 7, massive convoy activity, 150 plus heavy freight vehicles in organized formations. March 8th, complete evacuation, 0 vehicles, all buildings sealed. The imagery confirms that this wasn't gradual shutdown due to economic problems. This was rapid, organized extraction executed with military logistics precision. Aircraft movement tracking. Flight tracking data reveals coordinated air operations spanning 3 continents, Venezuela to Syria route. 6. Russian Il-76 cargo aircraft departing Caracas, March 6 to 7. Unusual flight paths avoiding NATO radar coverage. Emergency refueling stops at Allied African airfields. Final destinations, Khmeimim and Tartus, Russia's Syrian bases, Syria to China. Route 4, Chinese Y-20 strategic airlifters arriving. Damascus, March 8 to 9. Direct flights to Urumqi and Shanghai with maximum payload configurations. Chinese diplomatic clearances filed 72 hours in advance. The coordination required suggests months of advanced planning between Russian, Chinese, and Venezuelan military logistics specialists. Shipping pattern. Analysis. Maritime traffic analysis shows unusual vessel movements. 3 Russian-flagged bulk carriers departed La Guaira, port March 78. Vessels registered maximum displacement despite empty manifests. Navigation routes avoiding Western maritime monitoring systems. Final destinations. Novorossiysk, Russia, and Qingdao, China. Financial market positioning. Analysis of commodity derivatives. Markets reveals suspicious positioning ahead of the operation. Large silver futures, purchases by Russian and Chinese state entities 72 hours before extraction. Coordinated short positions against Western mining companies. Currency hedging patterns suggesting advanced knowledge of supply disruption. The positioning patterns indicate that key participants knew about the operation timing and positioned to profit from the resulting silver price spike. Communications. Intelligence. Intercepted communications between Venezuelan, Russian, and Chinese officials referenced Operation Simón beginning March 1st, 6 days before the extraction occurred. While specific operational details remain classified, the communications confirm that this was a coordinated state-level operation rather than opportunistic asset seizure. The hidden mechanism, how resource wars bypass international law. Understanding how 400 tons of silver can disappear from Venezuela without triggering international intervention requires grasping the sophisticated legal and diplomatic mechanisms that make resource appropriation appear legitimate while serving strategic warfare objectives. The sovereign partnership framework, Venezuela, Russia, and China have established bilateral agreements that classify resource transfers as strategic cooperation rather than commercial transactions. Under these frameworks, Resource movements appear as legitimate government-to-government assistance rather than asset seizure. The agreements include mutual defense clauses that make international intervention legally complex, as any attempt to prevent resource transfers could be classified as aggression against sovereign alliance partners. The humanitarian cover operation. Official statements describe the silver extraction as emergency evacuation of strategic materials to prevent theft by criminal elements allegedly threatening Venezuelan mining infrastructure. This humanitarian justification provides legal cover for resource appropriation while making Western opposition appear callous toward Venezuelan security concerns. The technical assistance disguise. Russian and Chinese personnel involved in the operation were officially classified as technical advisors, providing infrastructure modernization services, rather than military specialists executing resource extraction. This designation prevents the operation from being classified as foreign intervention while allowing unlimited personnel and equipment deployment under commercial cooperation agreements. The dual-use equipment. Justification. Aircraft and shipping used for silver transportation were officially transporting dual-use industrial equipment and humanitarian supplies rather than strategic materials. Since silver has legitimate industrial applications, the transportation appears as normal commercial activity rather than strategic resource appropriation. The international law gap. Current international frameworks assume that resource wars will occur through market manipulation rather than direct appropriation. There are no established mechanisms for responding to coordinated state-level resource extraction disguised as commercial cooperation. This legal vacuum allows sophisticated actors to appropriate resources through methods that technically comply with international law while serving strategic warfare objectives. The enforcement reality. Even if international bodies determined that resource appropriation had occurred, enforcement mechanisms depend on nations that may benefit from challenging Western resource access. Russia and China control UN Security Council veto power, making formal international response impossible when they coordinate resource appropriation operations. Eruption scenario. The Silver War escalation. Based on the Venezuelan operation's success and current global resource positioning, here's how the Silver Resource War will escalate into broader economic conflict. Phase 1. Replication. Across producer nations, next 3 or 6 months, similar infrastructure modernization operations occur in Peru, Bolivia, and other silver-producing nations where Russian and Chinese influence has grown. Each operation removes 200 to 500 tons of refined silver from global markets while appearing as legitimate government cooperation with allied nations. Phase 2. Western response failure, 6 to 9 months. Western nations attempt to counter resource appropriation through sanctions and diplomatic pressure, but discover that producer nations prefer Chinese strategic partnerships over Western commercial relationships. Traditional market mechanisms become irrelevant when resource flows are determined by strategic alliances rather than economic incentives. Phase 3. Industrial crisis, 9 to 12 months. Western technology companies face silver shortages that force production shutdowns. Solar panel manufacturing, electronics production, and medical device assembly become constrained by material availability rather than market demand. Stock markets react violently as investors recognize that technology company valuations assumed permanent access to materials that are no longer available through normal commercial channels. Phase 4. Strategic reserve depletion, 12-18 months. Western governments release strategic silver reserves to prevent complete industrial shutdown, but discover that reserves provide only temporary relief, while confirming to markets that resource scarcity is permanent. Emergency resource releases signal weakness rather than strength, encouraging additional resource appropriation by nations building alternative economic systems. Phase 5. System bifurcation, 18-24 months. Global economy splits into resource-controlling nations, Russia-China alliance, and resource-dependent nations, Western Bloc. Trade flows reorganize around resource access rather than comparative advantage. Western nations face permanent disadvantage in industries requiring materials controlled by rival powers, forcing economic restructuring around domestically available resources. The warning. The new rules of resource. Warfare. The Venezuelan silver operation represents more than commodity market disruption. It represents the emergence of new warfare methods where resource appropriation replaces military confrontation as the primary tool for shifting global power balances. For Western governments, traditional diplomatic and economic tools are inadequate when rival powers coordinate direct resource appropriation through sovereign partnership frameworks that bypass international law. Effective responses require recognition that resource wars are fundamentally different from economic competition, requiring strategic resource policies similar to military defense planning. For industrial companies, Business models built on assumptions of permanent resource access through commercial markets become unsustainable when resource flows are determined by strategic alliances rather than economic incentives. Companies dependent on materials controlled by rival nations face existential choices: relocate operations to resource-controlling territories or accept permanent disadvantage in global competition. For individual investors, traditional investment strategies assume that resource scarcity will be solved through market mechanisms that bring additional supply online. The Venezuelan operation proves that resource scarcity can be engineered through political action that overrides market signals. Physical ownership of critical materials provides protection against resource appropriation, while paper claims on commodities may become worthless when political considerations override commercial contracts. For national security, resource wars represent asymmetric warfare methods that can achieve strategic objectives without triggering military responses. Nations that control critical materials can inflict economic damage equivalent to military attack, while maintaining plausible deniability. Western nations need strategic resource policies that treat material security as equivalent to military security, including domestic production capabilities, strategic reserves, and alternative supply relationships with genuinely allied nations. The timeline. Urgency. The Venezuelan operation demonstrates that massive resource appropriation can occur within days using existing legal frameworks and transportation infrastructure. Similar operations targeting other critical materials, lithium, rare earth elements, cobalt, could occur simultaneously, creating multiple supply crises that overwhelm Western response capabilities. The individual response. For ordinary citizens, the Venezuelan silver disappearance provides clear evidence that global supply chains are vulnerable to political disruption, regardless of commercial contracts or market relationships. Preparing for resource scarcity requires focusing on essential needs that can be met through domestic production or genuine allies, rather than depending on global supply chains controlled by potentially hostile nations. The strategic reality? The Venezuelan operation was not theft or opportunism. It was strategic resource appropriation executed through sophisticated coordination between nations, building an alternative to Western economic dominance. This represents the new normal where resource access depends on strategic alliance membership rather than commercial purchasing power. Western nations that fail to adjust to this reality will discover that financial wealth means nothing when critical materials become unavailable at any price. The resource wars have begun. The Venezuelan silver operation was just the opening move in a broader campaign to reorganize global resource flows around strategic alliances rather than market mechanisms. China and Russia understand that controlling critical materials provides more leverage than military power or financial resources. Their coordinated resource appropriation strategy aims to force Western nations into permanent resource dependency that cannot be solved through traditional economic or military responses. The 400 tons of Venezuelan silver that vanished in hours was worth approximately $320 million at current market prices. But the strategic value of demonstrating that Western nations cannot protect resource access in their own hemisphere is worth far more than the silver itself. The operation was a message. The era of Western-controlled global resource flows has ended. The new era of strategic, alliance-controlled resource flows has begun. Those who understand this transition and position accordingly will thrive in the resource-scarce world that is being systematically created. Those who continue believing in market-based resource access will discover that markets no longer determine resource flows when strategic alliance membership becomes the primary qualification for material access. The silver is gone. The message has been delivered. The resource wars are accelerating. Choose your alliances carefully.